Anthem had one of the biggest falls from grace out of any video game in history. Originally, it was hyped to the moon for a few reasons. BioWare, the developers, were responsible for some of the most revolutionary and iconic RPGs of the 2000s with Mass Effect, Dragon Age, and even more titles I could mention. The original E3 trailer for Anthem in 2017 wowed the audience, showcasing a compelling third-person looter-shooter set in a wild, untamed world. The franchise seemed set to carry BioWare into a bright live service future. Years later, it was revealed that this trailer was almost entirely faked. It was smoke and mirrors, which unfortunately became apparent upon release. The game was received poorly, and the hype dissolved into vapor. The momentum for the game stopped, and it couldn't be saved. A Hail Mary Anthem 2.0, designed to fix all of the game's issues, was planned but never greenlit. The descent continued ultimately until its inevitable demise. The servers for Anthem closed today, January 12th, marking the official death of the game. Before the shutdown, I wanted to revisit the game one last time. I wanted to play through the campaign again and experience both the highs and lows of Anthem. I wanted to create this final retrospective of Anthem, to document a game that sadly will get lost to history. Did Anthem deserve this fate? Or is it a game with unappreciated value, a game that deserved better? Well, let's dive in and see. Anthem drops players into a beautiful yet dangerous world, one that hums to the tune of a mysterious force known as the Anthem of Creation. This world was created by mysterious beings known as Shapers, but for an unknown reason they abandoned their creation. Remnants of their work remain, and these are known as Shaper relics. These relics are powerful, and when they're overwhelmed by the Anthem of Creation, they can spawn disasters known as cataclysms. These cataclysms bend the very nature of reality, and the effects of each one are random and volatile. The main story centers around one of these cataclysms, the Heart of Rage. It's the biggest and nastiest of the cataclysms. The player takes on the role of a freelancer, who are tasked with both protecting their home of Fort Tarsus while also exploring the great unknown. He or she initially attempts to silence the Heart of Rage with their allies, Faye and Halleck. The mission goes horribly wrong, and it results in the dissolution of their friendship as well as the deaths of freelancers. Years later, the Monitor, the leader of the expansionist Dominion forces, aims to harness the Shaper relic in the Heart of Rage and harness the very Anthem of Creation. With it, he hopes to shape the entire world in his image. The freelancer must reunite with their friends and mend their broken relationship before venturing back to the Heart of Rage to stop this existential threat. Initially, Anthem impresses, with the first mission that has a really high production value. Although there are many foreign terms thrown this way and that, and the player doesn't understand what's going on fully, the mission captures a sense of excitement, and more importantly, danger. Combat is sharp, snappy, and polished, and beyond this, the game is incredibly pleasing to the eye. The art style captures this perfect mix of both realism and the unreal. The freelancer's armor is sharp and intricately detailed, and it stands out against the more fantastical environment with its bright colors and explosive visual effects. After this first mission ends in disaster, the player is dropped into the world and granted the ability to fly. From here, the wow factor only increases. It's funny, for how many games there are, so few of them give you the ability to fly. Anthem absolutely nails this feeling. The controls and the visual and audio design all coalesce to create a flying experience that is both weighty but also freeing, to the point of being sublime. Perhaps the greatest trick Anthem pulls, though, is how it grants you flight while still portraying the world as a place that's truly grand. This great stretch of Bastion the player gets to play around in captures the exact vibe it should for an untamed world. It feels like it dwarfs the player, making them feel little and insignificant. Movement mechanics, especially flight, have a dwarfing effect on the world. If you can travel from one end to another quickly, well, then the world doesn't feel very big. So the fact that Anthem captures this sense of scale, even with flight, is truly impressive. In summary, Anthem starts off firing on all cylinders. This momentum sadly only continues until the cracks in the game start to surface. The story grounds itself in interesting lore in a visually appealing world, but it doesn't amount to anything memorable. The main villain, the Monitor, definitely has an aura of mystique. His voice is intimidating, and he spits out some pretty good one-liners.
I find that pain is no substitute for money. So let's negotiate.
The relics, not for sale.
See, progress. You do have it. Now name your price, and we all walk away with something.
Relics are dangerous.
Only if you're careless.
However, his mission of using the Anthem to rule over the world is just about as generic villain behavior as you can get. Because of this bland motivation, the entire narrative slots into the typical save the world from the bad guy fare that holds few surprises. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for having a more standard story as long as it's executed well, especially if the characters within are likable and memorable. However, the main cast of Anthem is just okay. The player character, the freelancer, actually has a defined personality. He or she is a cocky hotshot hungry to prove themselves as a freelancer. Despite their swashbuckler attitude, they also have a strong moral compass. A large part of the story is the freelancer rebuilding his relationship with his friends, Halleck and Faye. Halleck is a fellow freelancer and mechanic who is in a bit of a slump after the first venture into the Heart of Rage. He's angry at the freelancer, who he views as a coward for not continuing the mission and instead forcing them to leave. In addition, he can't pilot his javelin due to a mental block. Faye is a cipher, which is sort of a telepathic person in the chair for freelancers. Think of the Oracle for Batman. Faye is the mediator of the trio, and she wants to help mend the relationship between Halleck and the freelancer. While in the Heart of Rage, she heard the Anthem of Creation, and it was so overwhelming and powerful that it burned across her brain. She deeply desires another encounter with the Anthem, but she's afraid of losing herself to it. As the mission to stop the Monitor goes on, these personal relationships and conflicts are explored. They're all resolved pretty much as you'd expect. Halleck eventually forgives the freelancer and overcomes his mental block to pilot his javelin, after the freelancer rescues him from a dangerous mission. Faye indeed encounters the Anthem of Creation at the end of the story, and although she is tempted, she of course ultimately resists it. Faye and Halleck have their moments, but unfortunately they're not very compelling. They're not the sorts of characters that leave a lasting impression on you and stick with you after the credits roll. I think the character with the most interesting story is Owen. Owen is another cipher, but he's working his way to becoming a freelancer himself. However, he's cocky and careless, unwilling to learn from his mistakes, so he never progresses.
I'd say we really took it to the Dominion back then, right? And I think we'll agree that I was pretty fantastic.
Oh, are you serious? That was a disaster. You were a disaster. Never do that again. Please.
Right.
He's downright unlikable when you meet him. He pretends there is something wrong with the cipher chair, messing with the poor cipher and sending her on a mission to fix it. It comes across as sociopathic, which, well, is exactly what Owen turns out to be. Over and over, the freelancer shuts down his antics and half-baked attempts to help, even rescuing him when Owen decides to enter a javelin and messes up. At a pivotal moment, Owen betrays the team, and he instead sides with the Monitor. Given Owen's building resentment, this plot twist doesn't come across as anything of a surprise. However, what's slightly novel is how this betrayal plot resolves. Your typical betrayal plot ends with a big confrontation between the betrayer and the main character. After a fight, the betrayer either decides to redeem themselves or go further down the path of evil, and I expected the same pattern from Owen. However, in Anthem, this big confrontation doesn't come. Owen indeed tries to help the Monitor, but their first attempt into the Heart of Rage goes horribly wrong. Owen is left scarred. This experience gives him a change of heart, at least partially, and he makes amends by helping the heroes. He provides them with a crucial component. However, he's still a rat at heart, and he flees before helping the heroes any further. Instead of a big confrontation nudging Owen to do the right thing, he instead has a change of heart of his own volition. It bucks the narrative anticipation of his betrayal, and it works. Now, is this the most groundbreaking plot thread ever? No. Has something like this been done before? Of course, yes. However, it's still a point in the story where I expected the game to go down Route A, but it went down Route B instead. I think if the game would have included a bit more risk in its story, and offered a few more twists and turns with its plot and characters like this one with Owen, it would have been more memorable. As it stands now, the story isn't bad. It can be mildly entertaining at times, but it's generic. I think the best way to describe it is as a low-tier Marvel movie. The story offers some entertainment, and you've seen far worse before, but it doesn't go further than being entertaining. The tone actually feels remarkably close to a low-grade Marvel movie too. There are a ton of jokes and quirky moments thrown in to provide levity. Some land and most don't, but a lot of it flies in the face of Anthem's dangerous world, and this clashing of tones can undercut some of the immersion. Given the pedigree of BioWare, who have created some of the most beloved stories in the medium, it just doesn't reach the bar. The story too feels far worse than it actually is due to the game's atrocious pacing. The game, on 4 separate occasions, forces a pause on the story to make you go down a series of side quests or check off boxes in the open world, aka free play. The most infamous of these is the Tomb of the Legionaries, a tedious affair where you spend hours in the open world checking off arbitrary goals, like finding 15 treasure chests. On my latest playthrough, I learned that this mission is actually account-wide, meaning once you complete it once, you never have to play it again. If you have to implement this sort of thing for a mission, maybe that means the game is better off without it. Anyway, these breaks completely kill the story's momentum, and it never gets a chance to really get going. As soon as you're getting a little interested in a plot thread, you're on a multi-hour break. It makes the story really hard to care about, and it's an issue beyond the writing itself. Since we touched on the open world, let's talk more about the open world of Bastion. It's an absolutely gorgeous world, with jaw-dropping vistas pretty much everywhere you look. Even more importantly, there's a real sense of character and identity to Bastion. There's a profound sense of verticality, with a great abundance of sheer cliffs and mountains always huddling around you. As I mentioned earlier, the wild and untamed nature fits perfectly with the game's lore. Amongst the sea of open world games out today, Bastion does stand out as visually unique, which is sincerely a tall compliment. The world design meshes well with the game's flight mechanics, and you can tell a lot of thought and care was put into its design. Javelin flight has a number of mechanics that make it, well, more than just holding the W key and flying. There's an energy that fills as you fly. When it maxes out, your suit will overheat, and you'll drop to the ground and be unable to take off again. There are ways, though, to cool down your flight bar. The first is by flying through water sources like waterfalls, which will cool down your flight bar and allow sustained flight. The other main way is to pitch downwards. Descending cools your flight bar, so the optimal way to maximize flight distance is to dip down when you can instead of merely flying in a straight line. The open world is catered to these mechanics, with constant valleys and dips for you to utilize to extend your flight, as well as waterfalls to cool down further. Flying in the open world is mechanically engaging, as you can leverage the environment to extend your flight, and this level of engagement makes it a lot of fun. This is why initially the open world seems like the perfect playground for a freelancer. The open world loses its luster quickly when you realize there is so little to do in it. It just feels so empty and devoid of meaningful activity. There are bounty missions and world events, but these are all fighting the same enemies that you already fight in the campaign. There's nothing that novel to sink your teeth into. The races are relatively fun, but, well, they're just flying through rings. It's a shame because for how cool the play space is designed, there just isn't much reason to stay in it. Let's move on to something a bit more positive, the gameplay. The javelins in Anthem feel incredible to pilot. I'll dive more into the specific javelin types later, so I'm just going to talk about them in the aggregate. There are just so many movement tools available to you. Dash, sprint, double jump, flight, and hovering are all tools available to you during combat, and they all feel useful at their chosen times. If I only could use a single word to describe Anthem's gameplay, I would use freeing or liberating. It just feels like you can do anything. You can move anywhere, go anywhere, attack your enemies from whichever spot you choose. You have the agency, I guess, to create your own game plan. No matter what the enemies throw at you, it feels like you have a tool to react. This level of freedom is very unique to Anthem, and there are very few games that replicate it. Beyond the liberation that the movement provides, the feedback of weapons and abilities deliver. Each of the weapon types handled distinctly, from the crunchy reports of the assault rifles to the high-spread flurry of machine pistols, yet they are all powerful in their own right. There's just enough recoil to make them come across as potent, yet they're still very accurate. The visual and audio effects of each javelin's abilities is impressive, and it hits home the superhero Iron Man fantasy of the javelins. The movement provides freedom, while the rest of your kit provides power. It's a wonderful combination. I'm sad to say though, this combat experience is sullied to a certain degree by lackluster enemy design. The enemies in Anthem feel woefully unequipped to deal with our javelins. For how creative the javelin designs are, the same love and care didn't seem to go into the enemies. For the most part, they're your bog standard ground units, foot soldiers, hounds, and the like. They helplessly stare up and shoot at this armored menace, merely waiting for the hellfire to rain down upon them. Regardless of what faction you're fighting, your enemies come across more like ants, as fodder for your javelin, rather than a true threat. Of course, you can tune up the difficulty and make their attacks hit harder, which does make them more challenging to fight. The difficulty isn't what I'm criticizing, more so their design. Your Javelin has so many different tools and abilities. However, it doesn't feel like any threat in the game forces you to change up your tactics. For a game about flying, it's surprising how few enemies can actually fly too. You can imagine if they added enemies that are menaces in the air, perhaps forcing you to fight from the ground. Or alternatively, enemies could create zones of denial on the ground, like lava pools or something, forcing you to remain airborne and manage your flight bar wisely. The Javelin has so many tools, but nothing forces you to choose between them in a meaningful way. Therefore, your choices in combat can begin to feel arbitrary. It's a bit hard to articulate what I'm saying, but when you compare the factions of Anthem versus something like Destiny, I think the distinction becomes more apparent. In Destiny, the enemy factions are varied and they force you to change up your tactics. The Swarming Hive forces you to play differently than the Cabal. By the way, I'm talking about Destiny 1. I'm aware that Destiny 2 has insane power creep, and Guardians nowadays flay through enemies like fodder too. My point though is that sort of variety is what Anthem is missing. Because the game doesn't offer distinct challenges on the enemy front, all the fights start to blend together, and none of them stand out as memorable. Although I enjoyed the combat encounters in Anthem, I can't recall many of them in particular. There are a couple times where Anthem does this variation well. For instance, the Titan mini-bosses send out rings of fire, which makes you use your movement in particular ways. You can't just hover in the air or you'll get burned. The game would have benefited from more mechanics like this. Anthem is a looter shooter. We covered the shooter part, so now let's cover the looter part. I don't have good news to report here. Sadly, the biggest ball Anthem drops is perhaps the loot, which is a cardinal sin in a game like this. In a looter shooter, one of the most exciting things is to pick up a shiny new gun, right? It's the entire loop the game is based on. Shoot enemies, get a prize. That joy is entirely absent in Anthem. Before I mentioned how the different weapon types, such as assault rifles versus shotguns, feel distinct. However, the weapons you loot in said category are just about identical. Every single assault rifle you loot looks virtually indistinguishable, with a simple palette swap and maybe one small detail on the gun model changed. There are 2 or 3 different AR archetypes, and these 3 similar looking guns are the only things you'll loot throughout the campaign. In other looter shooters, there's a sense of progression. You know, starting with your dull looking gray rarity gun and upgrading to more flashy blues and purples. Anthem lacks that satisfaction. Because enemies level with you too, the stat upgrades of your guns aren't felt in game. The weapons you use in the first mission feel no better or worse than the weapon you're using in the last. Weapon loot feels entirely pointless, and I almost think it should have been scrapped entirely. What's also bizarre is how you retrieve the loot. In most games, you get an in-world drop, and when you pick it up, you see exactly what you got right away. There's a sense of immediacy and satisfaction to this. Anthem instead doesn't reveal your weapon loot until the end mission screen. The disconnect from when you pick up an item versus when you get to see what it is robs the game of the simple dopamine hit of instant gratification that makes these games fun to play. It's a baffling choice. The one aspect where loot doesn't entirely fall flat is with Javelin abilities. For instance, with the Storm Javelin, you can loot different elemental abilities that do genuinely change up gameplay. As an example, you can loot an ability that shoots a flurry of ice shards, which replaces a massive fireball that you had to charge up before throwing. The only loot I was excited to get were these abilities. Overall though, this poor loot system has downstream effects. The game trains you not to care about loot. One of Anthem's big criticisms is that there's no endgame content. However, even if the game had robust endgame content, where would the incentive be to play it? The game has already conditioned the player to not care about loot, and therefore not to care about chasing endgame loot. Loot is the game's biggest mismark. However, I want to move on from Anthem's worst aspect to its best, and that is the hero fantasy of the javelins. Anthem has 4 types of javelins, and the identity of each is very distinct. The Ranger is the most versatile javelin, conforming to your soldier archetype. Able to utilize a variety of weaponry like missile systems, the Ranger really fulfills the fantasy of being Iron Man. The Interceptor is a rogue, ninja-style javelin, excelling in agility and melee, with powerful abilities like ninja stars and poison bombs. The Storm Javelin is a master of the elements, raining down lightning and fire and ice upon enemies. Lastly, the Colossus is your big tanky fighter. The Javelin is like Hulkbuster armor, meant to dominate the enemy with strength. Each of these javelins appeals to a different hero fantasy, and it's impressive how different each javelin feels to play. During my playthrough, I played with the Ranger, Interceptor, and Storm Javelins. I didn't get to use the Colossus sadly. Anthem locks the Javelins account wide, which is another odd decision, and it meant I couldn't just start another playthrough to try the Colossus, and frankly I just didn't have time to unlock it before the game shut down. But based on my experience with the other 3 and the footage of the Colossus, I can go out on a limb and say that the Colossus feels even more different to play than the others. The difference between Javelins goes further than mere ability swaps. The very way in which they move is different. The Ranger's dashes and jumps are short yet powerful bursts. The Storm Javelin's dashes and jumps meanwhile feel floaty, as if you're drifting across a bed of clouds. The Interceptor finally is far more agile, able to chain together multiple dashes and perform acrobatic flips while jumping. The Storm Javelin uses less fuel while hovering, so you can hover in the air longer. You're meant to be an airborne presence, casting abilities down on your enemies, while the Interceptor dashes into combat and cuts down enemies with melee combos not afforded to the other Javelins. When I originally played Anthem, I fell in love with the Storm Javelin, and seeing how this latest playthrough is the last time I'll ever get to play the game, I just wanted to stick with what I already enjoyed. The visual design of the Javelin, with its glowing elemental arm and drifting cape, just appeals to me, and the ability to combo elemental abilities like chaining lightning attacks into frozen enemies is an experience that only Anthem can provide. However, I branched out to the Interceptor, and I loved its gameplay loop almost as much as the Storm Javelin. Flipping around the battlefield and hucking shurikens at enemies, shredding their health bars in an instant, offered an entirely different gameplay loop, but one equally as compelling. What I love too is how customizable the Javelins are visually. This game was intended to have a flourishing microtransaction system, so the ability to swap out armor pieces is pretty stingy. However, you have full reign on the materials each armor piece is composed of, be it leather or various metals, and the paint options for each piece is extensive. You could even customize the amount of wear on the armor. I spent a lot of time customizing my armor, and I had a lot of fun doing so. Although I just know I'm going to get flamed in the comments for my choices, just like in my Halo Reach video. Anthem is a game with many flaws, as I've talked about, and few qualities ascend to great heights. However, the one truly special thing about Anthem is that it nails the hero fantasy. The Javelins deliver on the promise of their unique fun archetypes. When you combine their design with the overall polish and freedom of gameplay that I discussed earlier, piloting the Javelins not only feels amazing but also unique. It scratches a particular itch that no other game has replicated in quite the same way. So now that we've gone over the game's successes and missteps, let's put everything into perspective. Anthem's legacy will always be tainted by a sense of great disappointment, given the significant amount of hype leading up to its release. So in this final look at Anthem, as its servers go dark, was this disappointment justified? Is Anthem a secret 10 out of 10 experience? A game that's maligned unfairly? Well, no, not really. Anthem had a significant amount of flaws, and much of what it offers is either half-baked or mediocre, from the story to the loot to the open world. It's not a masterpiece. All of the 6 and 7 out of 10 reviews were pretty on the money. However, that's not the end of the discussion. I've noticed recently that people have a tendency to be pretty binary about games. Either a game is a masterpiece or it's trash that belongs in a garbage can. Anthem, I think, is a perfect testament to a game that doesn't reach greatness, but it's one worth preserving nonetheless. For all of its flaws, Anthem does offer something special. There simply isn't another game out there that captures the feeling of playing as a Storm or Interceptor Javelin. Despite a game being considered mediocre or even bad, it can still offer something no other game provides. That one special detail or experience that resonates with a certain segment of the audience. Even though Anthem wasn't the game everyone hoped for, its loss is still a tragedy to me. And that's a big reason why I wanted to make this video. Anthem is a great example of why the preservation of games is important, even the quote-unquote bad or mediocre ones. Not all of Anthem clicked with me, but a part of it certainly did, and that should be enough. Anthem deserved to be preserved, to be playable, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who had found some level of value or fun with this game. And the people Anthem might have resonated with, well, they'll never get to try it now. The story of Anthem isn't going to stick with me. Neither will the characters or the world of Bastion, even if it's pretty. What will stick with me though is piloting the Storm Javelin and the sheer sense of freedom and fun it provided. It's what I will sorely miss about this game. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or subscribing. As always, I love hearing your thoughts in the comments. I really appreciate you joining me on this journey and giving a final farewell to Anthem. Until next time.